The scream tore through the garden before the first course had even been served. Eleanor Hartley sat at the head table in her wedding gown, laughing at something her aunt had whispered, when the sound cut across the music and silenced every voice at once. Glasses stopped clinking. Forks froze in the air. Then came the second scream, closer this time, and the thunder of boots crushing the flower beds that had been planted just for this day. She did not have time to stand. A gloved hand closed over her mouth from behind, and the world tilted sideways as she was lifted clean off her chair. Her veil caught on the tablecloth and tore free with a sound like a small gasp. She kicked, she twisted. She tried to scream through the hand pressed against her lips, but the man who held her was built like a wall, and he carried her through the hedges as though she weighed nothing at all. Behind her, she heard her father shouting her name. She heard chairs crashing over. She heard her mother's voice break into something raw and terrified. And then she was through the garden gate, and a carriage was waiting with its door already open, and she was thrown inside onto a hard wooden bench before she could draw a full breath. The door slammed. The whip cracked. The carriage lurched forward so hard that she was thrown against the far wall, and through the small window she caught one last glimpse of her wedding breakfast, of white tablecloths and toppled chairs, and her father running after the carriage with his coat flying open, before the lane bent and the house vanished behind a row of elm trees. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Merriton, had been standing at the edge of the garden with the vicar only a few minutes earlier, going over a small correction to the wedding register, when the first scream reached him. He did not think. He ran. By the time he reached the head table, chairs were overturned and half the guests were on their feet, shouting questions that no one could answer. His future father-in-law, Lord Hartley, was on his knees in the flower bed where he had fallen trying to give chase, his palms scraped raw, his face white with shock. Julian did not stop to help him up. He sprinted through the gate his bride had been dragged through only moments before, just in time to see a carriage rounding the far bend of the drive, moving fast, its wheels throwing up gravel behind it. He shouted for his horse. It was not saddled. No one had expected him to need it during his own wedding breakfast, and the stable boy fumbled with the girth strap while Julian's hands shook with a fury he had never felt in his life. Every second the boy struggled was a second the carriage gained. When the horse was finally ready, Julian swung up without a coat, without a hat, still in his wedding clothes, and drove his heels into the animal's side so hard that it leapt forward as though struck by lightning. He reached the end of the drive only to find the lane splitting three ways, with no sign of which direction the carriage had taken. He sat there for one terrible moment, his heart pounding, his breath ragged, staring down three empty roads that all looked the same in the fading afternoon light. He chose the road to the east, toward the old post road that led out of the county, simply because it offered the fastest route away from anyone who might try to follow. It was, he told himself later, no more than a guess. But a guess was better than standing still. Inside the carriage, Eleanor had stopped struggling only because struggling accomplished nothing. The man who had carried her sat across from her now, a broad-shouldered stranger with a scar along one eyebrow, watching her with an expression she could not read. She noted everything she could about him, the color of his waistcoat, a signet ring on his smallest finger, the faint smell of tobacco and horse leather that clung to his coat. If she was going to survive this, she was going to need every detail she could gather. "Where are you taking me?" she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, though her hands trembled in her lap. The man did not answer. He only glanced out the window, checking the road behind them, and said nothing at all. She tried again. "My husband will come for me. He is already looking." At that, the man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "He isn't your husband yet," he said. "That's rather the point." The words settled over her like cold water. Whoever had planned this had planned it for exactly this moment, not before the ceremony, when a broken engagement might have raised fewer questions, and not after, when she would have been a duchess with the full protection of her husband's name and title. They had struck in the narrow gap between promise and vow, when she belonged fully to no one yet. The carriage rattled on for hours. The afternoon light faded into evening, and evening deepened into a moonless dark. Eleanor watched the road through the window for as long as she could see anything at all, memorizing every crossroads, every church spire, every distinctive tree, though she had no way of knowing if any of it would ever matter. At last the carriage turned off the main road and began climbing along a rougher track, the wheels jolting hard enough to knock her against the seat again and again, until finally it stopped in front of a low stone building half swallowed by trees. A hunting lodge, she thought, taking in the shuttered windows and the single lantern burning by the door, isolated, far from any village, exactly the kind of place where a person could disappear. She was led inside, not roughly, which surprised her, but with a strange, formal courtesy that unsettled her more than violence would have, and shown to a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window too small for a person to climb through. The door was locked behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed in her ruined wedding gown, her hands finally still now that there was no one watching her, and allowed herself, for exactly 1 minute, to be afraid. Then she stood, walked to the window, and began studying the grounds outside as carefully as she had studied the road. Miles away, Julian Ashcombe reined in his exhausted horse at a crossroads tavern, the only light for miles in the black countryside. He had ridden until the animal was foaming at the mouth and his own arms ached from gripping the reins, chasing a road that might have been entirely the wrong one. He was no longer certain of anything except that stopping was not an option. The tavern keeper, a heavy-set man named Ned Caro, stepped out at the sound of hooves, took one look at the wild-eyed young man in torn wedding finery, and did not ask questions before fetching him water and a fresh horse from his own stable. "Carriage," Julian managed, his voice hoarse. "Moving fast. 4 horses, dark green paint on the door. Did it pass this way?" Ned rubbed his jaw. "About 2 hours back. Didn't stop. Nearly ran over my dog, if I'm honest with you." It was the first solid piece of ground Julian had stood on since the garden. Which way did it go? Kept on east, toward the old Faro lands. Nothing much out that way anymore. Family lost most of it years back in the courts. The Faro lands. Julian's stomach turned cold as pieces he had not thought to connect suddenly slid into place. An old dispute, a debt never settled, a bitterness that had simmered quietly for years and had apparently just found its breaking point on the worst possible day. He thanked Ned, mounted the fresh horse, and rode on into the dark, the name Faro burning in his mind like a brand. Behind him, the tavern keeper stood in his doorway a long while, watching the road, before going back inside to bank his fire, unaware that he had just handed a desperate man the first true thread of hope he'd had all night. At the lodge, Eleanor had not slept. She had spent the hours pacing the small room, counting her steps from wall to wall, listening at the door for any change in the voices outside. She had counted at least 3 men, perhaps 4, speaking in low tones she could not make out. Once she heard the creak of the front door and the sound of a horse being led away, and she pressed her ear to the door, straining to catch any word that might tell her where she was or what was planned for her. She heard only one name clearly, spoken with an edge of impatience: Pruitt. She did not know the name, but she committed it to memory all the same, along with everything else. The direction the moon had risen from her window, the smell of pine and damp stone, the distant sound of water that might have been a stream. Whatever happened next, she intended to remember every piece of it, because pieces, she had decided, were the only weapon she had. Somewhere out in the dark, a duke who had not yet spoken his vows was riding toward her as fast as his borrowed horse could carry him, chasing a name he did not yet fully understand, certain of only one thing in the world. Back at the Hartley estate, the wedding breakfast had dissolved into chaos long before the last of the guests understood what had actually happened. Lord Hartley, still bleeding from where the gravel had torn his palms, had sent riders in every direction before he even thought to send word to the local magistrate, driven less by procedure than by a father's blind need to do something, anything, that might bring his daughter home faster. Eleanor's mother had been carried inside by 2 of the housemaids, too undone by shock to stand on her own, and it was Nora Bell, Eleanor's old nurse since childhood, who finally managed to bring some order to the frightened household, gathering the remaining guests and sending them home with quiet, steady instructions rather than false comfort. No one in that garden had truly believed such a thing could happen. Eleanor and Julian's courtship had been the gentlest kind of scandal the county had seen in years, not because of any impropriety, but because of how plainly happy they had seemed together, from the very first evening they were introduced at a dinner given by mutual friends. Julian, usually reserved to the point of coldness in company, had spent that entire evening arguing cheerfully with Eleanor over a point of inheritance law, delighted rather than offended to find a woman willing to correct him in front of a room full of witnesses. Eleanor, for her part, had gone home that night and told her mother, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she had just met the man she intended to marry. Nothing in the 18 months since had given either of them reason to doubt it. That history made the violence of the wedding breakfast feel all the more senseless to everyone who witnessed it. There had been no warning, no argument, no hint of danger in the days leading up to the ceremony. One moment the garden had been full of laughter and clinking glasses, and the next it had been full of screaming and running feet, as though some entirely different, crueler world had reached in and torn a hole through the middle of an otherwise ordinary, happy day. Eleanor, locked in her small room at the lodge, knew nothing of the chaos she had left behind, though she could guess at some of it well enough. She thought of her mother's face at breakfast that morning, glowing with a happiness Eleanor had rarely seen in her, and the thought of that happiness curdling so suddenly into terror was, in its own way, harder to bear than her own fear for herself. She resolved, sitting there in the dark, that whatever else happened, she would find her way back to that garden, back to the people who loved her, even if she had to claw her own path there one loosened floorboard at a time. He was not going to stop until he found her. Dawn found Julian Ashcombe still in the saddle, his eyes burning from lack of sleep, his borrowed horse laboring beneath him as the sky turned from black to gray to a pale, uncertain gold. He had not stopped since leaving the tavern except to ask directions from a farmer loading his cart before sunrise, and again from a shepherd moving his flock along a ridge, neither of whom had seen a carriage, but both of whom pointed him deeper into the hills where the old Farrow estate had once stood. He knew the story only in pieces, the way a person knows a scandal that happened before they were born. The Farrow family had once held land bordering his own, prosperous and proud, until a series of bad investments and a costly court battle over a disputed inheritance had stripped them of nearly everything. Julian's own father had been on the winning side of that dispute, though he had died believing the matter settled and forgotten. Clearly, someone in the Farrow line had not forgotten at all. He reached the town of Bexmore by mid-morning, a small market village at the edge of the old Farrow lands, and went straight to the magistrate's office, only to find it locked and the magistrate himself away at a county assizes 2 days' ride distant. Julian did not have 2 days. He did not have 2 hours to spare on a man who could not help him. Instead, he sought out the parish clerk, an elderly man named Silas Gray who had lived in Bexmore his whole life, and knew every family, every feud, and every secret worth knowing. Julian described what had happened, watching the old man's face carefully as he spoke. Silas Gray's expression darkened at the mention of the name Farrow. "There's a cousin," he said slowly. "Gerald Pruitt. His mother was a Farrow before she married. He spent years going about saying the courts robbed his family, that one day he'd see it put right. Nobody took him seriously. Man never had 2 coins to rub together, let alone the means to do something like you're describing. Where would I find him?" "There's an old hunting lodge up past Crake Ridge. Belonged to the Farrows before the courts took the rest of it. Nobody's touched it in years, so far as I know. But if a man wanted somewhere quiet and forgotten to hide something, that's where I'd look first." Julian was back in the saddle before Silas Gray had finished speaking. At the lodge, Eleanor had spent a second sleepless night listening at her door, and by the gray hours of early morning she had built a rough map of the building in her mind. There were at least 4 men guarding the place, though only 2 seemed to remain at any given time, the others coming and going on errands she could not identify. There was a kitchen somewhere to the rear of the house, judging by the smell of wood smoke each morning. There was a stable, and in it, she guessed, no more than 2 or 3 horses, since she had heard hooves only twice since her arrival. When the door finally opened that morning, it was not one of the guards who entered, but a man she had not seen before. Tall, thin, dressed with a formality that seemed strange for a hunting lodge in the middle of nowhere, his eyes sharp and calculating in a way that made her skin prickle. "Miss Hartley," he said, with a small bow that felt more mocking than courteous, "I apologize for the manner of your arrival. Circumstances required speed rather than grace. Who are you?" "Gerald Pruitt. You won't know the name, but your intended husband's family certainly will, if you ask them." He studied her for a moment, the way a man might study a ledger, weighing figures. "I'll be direct with you, since I think you'd prefer that to false kindness. My family was ruined by a court judgment that favored the Duke of Merriton's father over mine. I have spent a great many years watching that family prosper while mine crumbled to nothing. I intend to correct that. By kidnapping me on my wedding day. By marrying you myself," he said, as though the plan were entirely reasonable. "A woman of your standing, married into my family instead of his, restores a great deal of what was taken from us. It isn't personal, Miss Hartley. It's simply arithmetic." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest, but she kept her voice level, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "I'm already promised to another man. I will not marry you." "You will find," Pruitt said, moving toward the door, "that circumstances have a way of changing a person's mind. I'll give you a few days to grow accustomed to the idea. There's no need to rush these things." He left without waiting for her response, and the lock clicked shut behind him. Eleanor sat very still for a long moment after he had gone, turning his words over in her mind. He had given her days, not hours. That meant time, time to think, time to plan, time to look for any weakness in the walls around her. She went to the small window and studied it again more carefully than before. It was too small for her to fit through, certainly, but there was a gap along the frame where the wood had warped with age, wide enough that she might, with patience and a sharp enough tool, work the whole frame loose. She had no tool, but there was a hairpin still tangled in what remained of her ruined wedding veil, and a hairpin, she decided, was better than nothing at all. By midday, Julian had reached the base of Crake Ridge, where the track narrowed to little more than a footpath winding up through dense trees. He left the horse tethered at the bottom, judging that the sound of hooves on the rocky ground would carry too far and warn anyone listening above. He climbed the rest of the way on foot, moving as quietly as his exhaustion and his ruined wedding boots would allow. Near the top of the ridge he found what he was looking for. A low stone lodge set back from the path, smoke rising thin and pale from its chimney, and a single man standing guard near the front door with a hand resting casually on his belt. Julian crouched behind a fallen tree and watched for a long while, counting the comings and goings, memorizing the guard's habits, the times he paced and the times he stood still. He needed more than his own 2 hands to take this place safely. Rushing in alone, exhausted and unarmed, would accomplish nothing, except getting himself killed and leaving Eleanor with no one at all to help her. It was the hardest decision of his life, but he forced himself to back away from the ridge, retrace his steps down to his horse, and ride back toward Bexmore to gather the help he needed. He found it in the last place he expected, not among the local men, who knew nothing of fighting, but in a former soldier named Captain Hollis who had settled near Bexmore after leaving the army, and who Silas Gray vouched for without hesitation. Hollis listened to Julian's account with a soldier's calm, asked a handful of sharp, practical questions, and then began at once organizing what few men in the village had any experience with weapons or with danger. By late afternoon, Julian had assembled 6 men willing to ride with him. Not soldiers, not an army, but enough. Enough, he told himself, gripping the reins with hands that had not stopped shaking since the garden the day before, to bring her home. As the small company set out from Bexmore toward Crake Ridge, the sun beginning its long slide toward evening, Julian allowed himself, for the first time since the wedding breakfast, a single fragile thought that was almost hope. She was resourceful. He knew that about her, had known it since the earliest days of their courtship, when she had out-argued him on a point of law at a dinner party and left him more charmed than offended. Whatever was happening to her in that lodge, he did not believe for a moment that she was simply waiting to be rescued. He only hoped she could hold on long enough for him to reach her. Back at the lodge, Eleanor had worked the hairpin loose from her veil and begun, slowly and carefully, prying at the warped edge of the window frame whenever she judged the guards were occupied elsewhere. It was slow, frustrating work, her fingers aching within minutes, splinters catching under her nails, but she did not stop. Each small movement of the wood, however slight, felt like progress, like proof that she was not simply a prisoner waiting for someone else to decide her fate. She thought of Julian as she worked, of the last look on his face across the garden before everything had gone wrong. Not fear, she realized now, remembering it clearly, but a fierce, immediate readiness, as though some part of him had already begun moving before the rest of him understood why. She did not know how far away he was, or whether he had any idea where to look for her, but she found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid he wouldn't come. She was only afraid she might not last long enough to make it easy for him when he did. Silas Gray had not slept much that night either, though he was far from the ridge and far from any real danger. Long after Julian had ridden off toward Crake Ridge, the old clerk sat by his own fire turning the matter over in his mind, troubled by a detail he had not thought to mention in the urgency of the moment. Gerald Pruitt was not, so far as Silas knew, a man capable of arranging 4 hired men and a hunting party's worth of provisions on his own. Someone had lent him the means to do what he had done, and Silas found himself deeply uneasy at not knowing who. He rose before dawn and walked to the small church at the edge of Bexmore, where the parish records were kept, and spent the early hours combing through old ledgers of land transfers and debts, searching for any name connected to the Farrow estate that might explain where a penniless cousin had suddenly found the resources for hired men, horses, and a carriage capable of outrunning pursuit. He found, buried in a transaction from several years past, a small loan extended to Gerald Pruitt by a distant relation living 2 counties away. A man named Everett Cole who had married into money and had, according to the local gossip Silas remembered now, always resented the Ashcombe family's rise in local standing. It was not proof of anything, not yet, but it was enough to trouble Silas deeply, and he made certain, when Julian returned briefly to Bexmore to gather Captain Hollis and the others, to pass along everything he had found. Julian listened with the grim patience of a man who had already absorbed more bad news in the past 2 days than he cared to hold at once, and resolved to deal with the question of Everett Cole once Eleanor was safely home, rather than let it slow the rescue itself. At the lodge, the days settled into a strange, watchful rhythm that Eleanor came to know intimately. Meals were brought to her twice a day by a guard who never spoke, a heavy-set man with kind eyes that did not match the rest of his hard, silent manner. She began, out of both boredom and calculation, to study him as closely as she studied everything else, noting that he always paused a moment too long before locking the door again, as though some part of him disliked the task he had been given. On the second evening, she tried speaking to him directly for the first time. "You don't seem like a man who enjoys this work," she said quietly, as he set down her tray. The guard said nothing at first, though his eyes flickered toward her with something that might have been surprise. "Wasn't given much choice in it, miss," he finally said, his voice low and rough. "Owed Pruitt a debt. This was how he chose to collect it. Then you understand something about being trapped by circumstances beyond your control," Eleanor said carefully, "as I am trapped now." The guard's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she had pushed too far, that she had ruined whatever small opening she had found. But he only picked up her empty water pitcher, refilled it from a jug he carried, and set it back down without meeting her eyes. "Debt's near paid," he muttered, so quietly she almost missed it. "Few more days, I'm done here regardless of how this ends." It was not freedom, and it was not even a promise of help, but it was information, and Eleanor filed it away with everything else, understanding now that Pruitt's small company of guards was held together by obligation rather than loyalty, a weakness that might, if she found the right moment, be turned to her advantage. She spent that night lying awake, listening to the wind moving through the trees outside her window, thinking not of fear but of arithmetic of her own. How many days remained before the guard's debt was paid? How many chances she might have left to reach someone willing to carry word beyond these walls? How much longer her own patience could hold before desperation began to cloud her judgment? She had always thought of herself, before all this, as a fairly ordinary young woman, fond of books and gardens and quiet evenings with people she loved. She had never once imagined she might also be the kind of woman who could spend 4 days calmly plotting her own survival, piece by careful piece, without ever quite allowing herself to break. It surprised her, in the strange suspended hours of that second night, to realize she was rather proud of that discovery, even in the middle of everything still working against her. The window frame gave way just after dusk, coming loose so suddenly that Eleanor nearly lost her balance and fell backward onto the floor. She sat there for a moment, staring at the narrow gap she had opened, hardly able to believe that 2 days of patient, aching work had actually accomplished something. The gap was still too small for her to climb through, but it was large enough now to pass a note if she could find someone willing to carry one, and large enough, she realized with a small thrill of hope, to see and hear far more of the grounds outside than she had been able to before. She pressed her face to the opening, and breathed in the cool evening air, listening. Somewhere below the lodge she could hear the faint trickle of water, the stream she had guessed at from the smell days before, and beyond that, very faintly, the creak of a gate. She strained her ears and caught the low murmur of voices, and among them, unmistakably, the sound of a young voice, lighter than the others, that did not belong to any of the men she had heard guarding her door. A servant, she thought. A boy, judging by the pitch of his voice, likely sent up from the village to fetch supplies or tend the horses. If she could reach him, even for a moment, she might have her first real chance to send word beyond these walls. She waited 3 long days for that chance, growing more restless with each one, as Gerald Pruitt visited her twice more, each time with the same patient, unsettling courtesy, each time pressing his case a little further, speaking of arrangements already being made, of a clergyman who could be persuaded to overlook certain formalities for the right price. Eleanor gave him nothing but calm refusal each time, though privately she felt the walls of her patience thinning with every visit. On the 4th morning, her chance finally came. She heard the boy's voice again below her window, closer this time, and risked calling down in a low, urgent whisper. "Please, I need your help." The voice below went silent for a moment, and then a face appeared, tilted up toward her window, a boy of perhaps 13, thin and sharp-eyed, wearing a stable hand's rough clothes, and an expression caught somewhere between curiosity and fear. "You're the lady they're keeping up there," he said, not quite a question. "I am. Please, what is your name?" "Tommy," he said. "Tommy Ridley. My uncle works the stable here sometimes, when they need extra hands." He glanced nervously toward the front of the lodge. I shouldn't be talking to you. I know, I'm sorry to ask it of you, but I need someone to carry a message, and you're the only person I've seen who isn't one of them. She had already thought through what she would say if this moment ever came, and she spoke quickly now, before her courage or his could fail. I am Eleanor Hartley. I was taken from my own wedding 4 days ago. My betrothed is the Duke of Merriton, and I promise you, if you help me, he will see that you and your family are rewarded beyond anything you can imagine. All I need is for someone to know where I am. Tommy's eyes had gone wide at the mention of a duke, and wider still at the word rewarded, but it was something else in his face that told Eleanor she had reached him. A flicker of plain, honest outrage at the idea of a woman being held against her will in a lodge in the hills. What do I tell him? Eleanor thought fast, drawing on every detail she had gathered over her days of watching and listening. Tell him it's the old Pharaoh Lodge, past Crake Ridge, up a footpath from the main track. Tell him there are men guarding it, at least 4, maybe more. Tell him the man behind it is called Gerald Pruitt, and tell him— She hesitated only a moment. Tell him I am well, and I am waiting, and I have not stopped fighting. Tommy nodded, already glancing back toward the lodge with the wary look of a boy who knew he was risking more than he could afford to lose. I know the roads round here better than anyone. If your Duke is close, I can find him faster than any grown man could. Be careful, Eleanor whispered as he backed away from the window. Please, Tommy, be careful. He was gone before she finished speaking, slipping between the trees with the quiet, practiced ease of a boy who had spent his whole life moving unseen through these hills. Julian and his small company had made camp 2 nights earlier, at the base of Crake Ridge, close enough to watch the lodge but far enough not to be seen themselves. Captain Hollis had insisted on patience, on watching the guards' patterns for at least a full day before attempting anything, and though every instinct in Julian screamed against waiting even 1 more hour, he forced himself to trust the older man's judgment. A hasty attack, Hollis reminded him more than once, was as likely to get Eleanor killed as it was to save her. They had learned a good deal in their days of watching. There were indeed 4 guards, rotating in pairs, with Gerald Pruitt himself coming and going from the village below on some errand or another every 2nd day. The lodge's only entrance faced the footpath they had climbed, but there was a second, narrower door at the rear, near the kitchen, that seemed to go unwatched most hours of the night. It was on the morning of the 4th day, as Julian and Hollis crouched behind the fallen tree reviewing their plans yet again, that a thin, breathless boy came scrambling up the footpath toward their camp, having somehow talked his way past the 2 men Hollis had posted to watch the trail. You're looking for a lady, the boy gasped, before anyone could stop him. Eleanor Hartley. She sent me. Julian was on his feet before the boy finished the sentence, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, his heart hammering so hard he could barely hear his own voice. Where is she? Is she hurt? She's well, Tommy said quickly, remembering Eleanor's exact words with the careful precision of a boy who understood he was carrying something important. She said to tell you she's well, and she's waiting, and she hasn't stopped fighting. Something in Julian's chest, some knot that had been pulled tight since the garden 4 days ago, loosened just slightly at those words. He crouched down to the boy's level, forcing his voice steady despite everything roaring inside him. Tell me everything she told you. Every word. Tommy repeated it all, the name Gerald Pruitt, the count of guards, the layout as best Eleanor had been able to guess it from her window. Most of it matched exactly what Julian and Hollis had already observed themselves, which gave Julian a fierce, sudden confidence in every other detail the boy relayed. There's one more thing, Tommy added, glancing nervously between Julian and Hollis. I heard the men talking this morning, before I left. They're planning to move her. Tonight, I think. Or tomorrow at the latest. One of them said something about the lady's family getting close, about it not being safe here anymore. Julian looked at Hollis, and Hollis looked back at him with the grim, focused expression of a man recalculating every plan he had spent 3 days building. If they move her, Hollis said quietly, we lose whatever advantage the terrain gives us. We know this ridge. We won't know wherever they take her next. Then we don't let them move her, Julian said. Hollis studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Tonight, then, before they're ready for us. He turned to the boy, crouching down as Julian had, his voice gentler than Julian had yet heard it. You've done something very brave today, son. Braver than most grown men would manage. Can you get yourself safely back down to the village, and stay there until this is finished? Tommy nodded, though he looked reluctant to leave now that he had come this far. Go, Julian said, resting a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. You've already done more than I could have asked of anyone. Whatever happens tonight, Your part in it will not be forgotten." As Tommy scrambled back down the footpath toward the village, Julian turned to look up at the lodge through the trees, at the thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney into the darkening sky, and felt something settle in him that was steadier than hope and harder than fear. Before the boy's message arrived, the days of watching had tested Hollis's patience nearly as much as Julian's. On the second morning of their surveillance, a heavy rain had rolled in over the ridge, soaking the small camp and turning the footpath into a treacherous slide of mud and loose stone. Julian had wanted to press forward regardless, arguing that the rain would cover the sound of their approach as well as any darkness might, but Hollis had refused, pointing out with blunt practicality that a man who slipped and broke an ankle on that path would be worse than useless to Eleanor, and might well get others killed trying to carry him back down. They had waited out the storm huddled beneath a rough shelter of branches and oiled cloth, and it was during those long, miserable hours, with nothing to do but wait and worry, that Julian finally told Hollis the full history between his family and the Pharaohs, the old court case, his father's role in it, the quiet resentment he now understood had been simmering in Gerald Pruitt for years, without anyone in the Ashcombe family ever noticing. "Your father win it fairly?" Hollis had asked, watching the rain through the gap in their shelter. "As fairly as these things are ever won," Julian admitted. "The law favored him. Whether the outcome was just is a different question entirely, and one I've never had cause to examine closely until 3 days ago." "Doesn't excuse what Pruitt's done," Hollis said. "A man can have a fair grievance and still choose an unforgivable way of answering it." "No," Julian agreed quietly. "It doesn't excuse it, but it explains it, and I find I'd rather understand the man I'm about to face than simply hate him blindly. Hatred makes a man careless. I can't afford to be careless tonight, or any night, until Eleanor is safe." The rain had cleared by the following afternoon, and it was in the hours after that Julian and Hollis had refined their observations of the lodge into something resembling an actual plan, mapping the guards' rotations on a scrap of paper by firelight, debating the merits of the rear door against a more direct approach, arguing over timing until both men were satisfied they had considered every reasonable possibility available to them. It was into this careful, methodical planning that Tommy Ridley had come scrambling, breathless and full of news that changed everything in an instant, forcing Julian and Hollis to abandon the timeline they had spent 2 days building in favor of something far more urgent. Hollis, to his credit, adjusted without complaint, reorganizing the 6 men under his command with the calm efficiency of someone who had faced far worse surprises in his years of soldiering. "We move at nightfall," Hollis said, once the new plan had taken shape. "Full dark, no moon tonight if the clouds hold. We take the rear door first, quiet as we can manage, and hope surprise buys us enough time to reach her before anyone thinks to use her against us." Julian had spent the remaining hours of daylight in a state he did not have a name for, somewhere between terror and a fierce, focused calm, checking and rechecking the small collection of weapons Hollis had managed to gather, running the plan over and over in his mind until every step felt as familiar as breathing. He thought, more than once, of Eleanor's message carried by Tommy, that she was well, that she was waiting, that she had not stopped fighting, and found that those few words did more to steady his nerves than anything else could have. As the light began to fail over Crake Ridge, Julian gathered the small company for a final word before they began their climb, his voice steadier than he felt, though he suspected every man there could see straight through the calm to the fear underneath it. One of the men, a quiet farmer named Walter Prine, who had joined Hollis's company more out of neighborly duty than any real experience with danger, asked the question Julian suspected several of them had been holding back. "Begging your pardon, your grace, but why does a duke ride into this himself, rather than leaving it to men better suited for it? No offense meant." Julian considered the question seriously, understanding it deserved an honest answer, rather than a proud one. "None taken. The honest truth is that I don't know how to be the kind of man who sends others to do what he cannot bring himself to do personally, not when it concerns the person I love most in this world. Perhaps that makes me foolish, but I'd rather be foolish and present than wise and absent, if those are truly my only choices tonight." Walter nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied, and said nothing further, though Julian noticed the man checked his own borrowed blade with a little more care after that, as though the answer had settled something in him as well. They began their final climb as the last gray light faded from the sky, moving in careful pairs the way Hollis had drilled them over the preceding days, communicating in nothing more than hand signals and the occasional low whistle when the trees grew thick enough to separate one pair from the next. Julian found, as they climbed, that his earlier fear had settled into something quieter and more useful, a sharp, focused attention that noticed every snapping twig, every shift in the wind, every distant flicker of lantern light through the trees ahead. She was well. She was waiting. And tonight, at last, he was going to reach her. Night fell over Crake Ridge heavy and still, without a moon to light the footpath, which Hollis said was exactly the kind of dark they needed. Julian had never in his life wished so hard for darkness, and never in his life felt time move so slowly as it did in the hours between deciding to act and the moment they finally began to climb. Inside the lodge, Eleanor had noticed the change in the household almost as soon as evening fell. There was a hurried quality to the footsteps outside her door. Low voices exchanged more quickly than usual. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor in another room. She pressed her ear to the door and caught fragments. A mention of a carriage being readied, of leaving before first light, of somewhere farther north where no one would think to look. They were moving her. Whatever chance Tommy's message had given her was about to run out. She thought of the loosened window frame, of the narrow gap she had spent days prying open, and for the first time allowed herself to seriously consider whether she might fit through it after all, however unlikely. She measured the opening with her hands in the dark, judged the width of her own shoulders, and decided it was worth the attempt, even if it meant tearing her already ruined gown further, even if it meant scraping herself raw against the old warped wood. She had just begun working her arm through the gap, testing how far she might manage, when she heard footsteps stop directly outside her door, followed by the scrape of a key in the lock. She pulled back from the window just as the door swung open, revealing not a guard, but Gerald Pruitt himself, a lantern in one hand, and an expression on his face that had lost all its earlier patience. "It seems," he said, "that your Duke has been rather more resourceful than I gave him credit for. My men tell me there are strangers camped along the ridge below us. I imagine you know something about that." Eleanor said nothing, keeping her face as blank as she could manage, though her heart was hammering so hard she thought he must surely hear it. "No matter," Pruitt continued, setting the lantern down and moving toward her with the calm, deliberate steps of a man who had already decided on his next move. "We'll simply leave sooner than planned. There's a carriage being readied now. Once we're away from here, your Duke can search these hills for as long as he likes." He reached for her arm, and Eleanor, without fully deciding to, stepped back sharply out of his reach. "I won't go with you." Something flickered across Pruitt's face. Not anger exactly, but a thin, cold impatience that frightened her more than shouting would have. "I had hoped to avoid unpleasantness," he said quietly, "but I find myself running short on time to be gracious about it." He reached for her again, more firmly this time, his fingers closing around her wrist, and Eleanor, drawing on 4 days of fear and frustration, and stubborn refusal to be simply carried wherever this man decided to take her, twisted hard against his grip, and drove her free elbow into his side with every bit of strength she had. Pruitt staggered back with a sharp grunt of surprise, more startled than hurt, but it bought Eleanor the half-second she needed to duck past him toward the open door. She did not get far. One of the guards outside caught her before she had crossed the threshold, and within moments she was pulled back into the room, her wrists gripped firmly enough to bruise, though not, she noted even in her fear, with any real cruelty. Pruitt straightened, rubbing his side, and looked at her with something that might almost have been reluctant respect. "Spirited," he said. "I suppose I should have expected nothing less from a woman your Duke chose to marry." He nodded to the guard. "Bind her hands. Gently, if you please. We leave within the hour." Outside, in the dark trees below the lodge, Julian and Hollis's small company had begun their slow, silent climb up the final stretch of the footpath, moving in pairs, staying low, every man aware that a single misstep on the loose stone could give them away before they were ready. They were perhaps 100 yards from the lodge when the front door swung open and light spilled out across the clearing, followed by the sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps that told Julian, with a cold lurch of alarm, that something had changed. "They know we're here," Hollis murmured beside him, "or they're moving her regardless. Either way, we've lost the luxury of waiting." Julian did not need telling twice. He was already moving, faster than caution strictly allowed, closing the last stretch of ground between the tree line and the clearing with Hollis and the others close behind him. They reached the edge of the trees just as the lodge's front door opened again, and Julian's whole body went rigid at what he saw. Eleanor, her hands bound loosely in front of her, her wedding gown torn and stained with days of hard use, being led toward a waiting carriage by 2 of Pruitt's men, with Gerald Pruitt himself walking just behind her, watching the tree line with the wary alertness of a man who knew he was running out of time. Julian did not wait for Hollis's signal. He stepped out of the trees into the lantern light, his voice carrying clear and hard across the clearing. "Let her go, Pruitt." Every head in the clearing turned toward him at once. Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of him, exhausted, unshaven, still in the ruins of his wedding clothes, but standing there as solid and unshakable as she remembered him from every moment before the world had gone wrong. "Julian," she breathed, and took an instinctive step toward him before one of the guards caught her arm and held her back. Gerald Pruitt did not look surprised so much as resigned, as though he had known, on some level, that this moment was always coming. "Your Grace," he said, with a small, humorless bow, "I confess I hoped for a little more time." "You'll have none," Julian said. "Release her now, and I promise you a magistrate and a trial. Refuse, and I promise you considerably worse." Around Julian, Hollis and the rest of the company had emerged from the trees, spreading out to surround the clearing, and Pruitt's remaining guards, seeing the numbers arrayed against them, exchanged uncertain glances that told Julian everything he needed to know about how loyal their service truly was. "Put down your weapons," Hollis called to them, his voice carrying the flat, unmistakable authority of a man who had given such orders many times before. "This isn't a fight worth dying for, and you know it." One by one, the guards lowered their arms, stepping back from Eleanor with the relieved haste of men who had never much wanted to be part of this in the first place. Only Gerald Pruitt remained where he stood, his hand still resting on Eleanor's bound wrists, his eyes moving between Julian and the ring of men now closing around him. "It seems," Pruitt said quietly, "that my arithmetic was wrong after all." Julian took a single step forward, every muscle in his body coiled tight with 4 days of fear and fury finally given somewhere to go. "Let her go," he said again, quieter now, and somehow more dangerous for it. "This is your last chance to walk away from tonight as a man who was merely foolish, rather than one who was something far worse." Eleanor stood very still between the two guards who held her, her eyes fixed on Julian across the clearing, and found herself, in that strange suspended moment, thinking not of her own fear but of his. She could see it plainly in the tight line of his shoulders, in the careful, controlled way he held himself despite the exhaustion written all over his unshaven face. He had ridden through a night and 3 more days without proper rest, had gathered strangers into an army on the strength of nothing but desperate hope, and had climbed a hill in darkness not knowing whether he would find her alive or find nothing at all. She understood, watching him now, that whatever fear she had carried in that locked room, he had carried something heavier still, and had simply never allowed it to slow him down. "You think numbers alone decide this," Pruitt said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty, his eyes flicking between Julian and the ring of armed men closing steadily around the clearing. "You forget I still hold something you want." "I forget nothing," Julian said, "but holding her does you no good, if you have nowhere left to run, and no one left willing to help you keep her. Look around you, Pruitt. Your men have already made their choice." It was true, and everyone in the clearing could see it plainly. The 2 guards flanking Eleanor exchanged an uncertain glance, and the taller of the 2, the same heavy-set man with the kind eyes who had spoken quietly to Eleanor 2 nights before, about a debt nearly paid, slowly loosened his grip on her arm entirely, stepping back half a pace as though physically distancing himself from whatever Pruitt intended to do next. "Reckon my debt's settled enough," the guard muttered, mostly to himself, and Eleanor, feeling the pressure on her arm ease, seized the moment without hesitation, pulling free and putting several quick steps between herself and the men who had held her. Pruitt's composure finally cracked at the sight of it. "Stop her," he snapped at the remaining guard, but the man only shook his head slowly, unwilling to lay hands on a woman in front of 6 armed strangers and a furious duke, whatever debts he might still owe. "It's over, Pruitt," Hollis called from the edge of the clearing, his voice carrying the flat authority Julian had come to rely on these past days. "Every man here can see it. The only question left is whether you're foolish enough to make tonight worse than it already is." For a moment, Gerald Pruitt looked, to Eleanor's eyes, less like the calculating man who had visited her room with cold, patient certainty, and more like exactly what he was, a desperate, ruined man who had staked everything he had left on a plan now collapsing around him in front of witnesses. His hand drifted toward his coat, toward something Eleanor could not see clearly in the lantern light, and every man in the clearing tensed at once, Julian moving instinctively to place himself between Pruitt and Eleanor's retreating path. "Don't," Julian said, low and even. "Whatever you're reaching for, don't. There is still a version of tonight where you walk away breathing. Don't be the man who throws that away out of spite." Pruitt's hand stilled. For a long, taut moment, nobody in the clearing moved at all. The only sound the restless stamping of the carriage horses and the distant call of some night bird deep in the trees. Then, slowly, Pruitt let his hand fall back to his side, and something in his shoulders sagged, the last of his fight draining out of him all at once, though his eyes stayed fixed on Julian, with a bitterness that had not yet fully surrendered. Eleanor watched the whole exchange with her heart still pounding, standing now well clear of both men, close enough to Walter Prime that he had instinctively placed himself half a step in front of her without either of them discussing it. She found herself studying Pruitt's face in the lantern light, searching for some sign of the calculating, formal man who had visited her room days before, and found instead only exhaustion and a kind of bitter, disappointed grief that made him seem, for just a moment, almost pitiable rather than frightening. "You could have simply asked for help," she said quietly, surprising even herself by speaking at all. "There are more honest ways to repair a family's fortune than kidnapping a stranger from her own wedding." Pruitt's eyes flicked toward her, and something in his expression twisted, not quite anger, not quite shame. "Pride rarely allows for asking, Miss Hartley. I suspect a woman raised as comfortably as you were has never had cause to learn that particular lesson." "Perhaps not," Eleanor said, "but I've learned a great many other lessons this week, and I find pride matters a good deal less to me now than it once did." Hollis stepped forward then, closing the last distance to where Pruitt stood, and secured his wrists with the same quick efficiency he had shown throughout the night. "Save the rest for the magistrate," he said, not unkindly. "There's nothing more to be settled here tonight." For a long moment, no one in the clearing moved. The lanterns hung from the lodge's porch cast long, trembling shadows across the churned earth, and the only sound was the restless shifting of the carriage horses, still harnessed and ready for a journey that was never going to happen now. Gerald Pruitt's grip on Eleanor's bound wrists tightened, and Julian felt every nerve in his body sharpen at the sight of it. "Careful, Your Grace," Pruitt said, his voice low and taut. "I have very little left to lose tonight." "A desperate man is not always a cautious one." "You have your life," Julian said. "That is not nothing. My life without my family's name restored is worth very little to me." Pruitt's eyes flicked briefly to the ring of armed men surrounding the clearing, and something in his expression shifted, hardened, as though he had finally accepted that there would be no clean way out of this. "Perhaps I take something from you before this ends, then. Even the score a little, in my own way." He began pulling Eleanor backward toward the carriage, and Eleanor, refusing to be dragged a single step further after everything the past 4 days had cost her, planted her feet and twisted hard against his grip, driving her bound hands upward into his chest with all the force she could gather. The sudden movement caught Pruitt off balance. He stumbled, his hold on her wrist slipping, and in the half-second that followed, Julian closed the last of the distance between them, driving his shoulder into Pruitt's side, and knocking the man clear away from Eleanor entirely. They went down together in the trampled grass, Julian's fury and exhaustion meeting Pruitt's desperation in a brief, brutal struggle that neither man seemed fully in control of. Julian took a glancing blow to the jaw that snapped his head sideways, tasted blood, and answered it with a strike of his own that finally, mercifully, drove the fight out of the other man entirely. Pruitt lay still in the grass, dazed and beaten, and Hollis was there within seconds, hauling him upright and binding his hands with the same quick, practiced efficiency he had shown all night. "It's finished," Hollis said quietly, more to Julian than to anyone else. "Let it be finished." Julian, breathing hard, blood on his split lip, pushed himself upright and turned to find Eleanor already crossing the clearing toward him, her bound hands held awkwardly in front of her, her eyes bright with tears she had refused to let fall for 4 long days. He reached her in 2 strides and pulled her against him, careless of the rope still binding her wrists, careless of the blood on his face, or the ruin of both their wedding clothes, holding her as though he intended never to let go of her again. "I told him you would come," Eleanor said against his shoulder, her voice unsteady for the first time since the garden. "I told him I hadn't stopped fighting." "I heard," Julian murmured into her hair. "I heard, and it was the only thing that kept me moving these past 4 days." Around them, Hollis and the others were securing Pruitt and rounding up the guards who had surrendered their weapons, the whole desperate, chaotic night finally beginning to settle into something that looked, at last, like resolution. One of the men produced a knife and carefully cut the rope from Eleanor's wrists, and she rubbed at the raw marks left behind, wincing slightly, though her eyes never left Julian's face. "You're hurt," she said, touching his split lip with careful fingers. "It's nothing. It's less than nothing, compared to what you've endured." "We survived it," she said, "both of us. That's what matters now." Gerald Pruitt, bound and sitting against the trunk of a tree under guard, watched the two of them with an expression that had gone entirely flat, The fight and the desperation both drained out of him now that there was nothing left to fight for. "You'll have your trial, Your Grace," he said quietly, not quite meeting Julian's eyes. "I only ask that whatever happens to me, it happens quickly." "That will be for the magistrate to decide," Julian said, without any warmth, though without the fury of moments before either. "You've done enough deciding for other people this week." Dawn was beginning to lighten the sky by the time the company started back down the footpath, Pruitt and his men bound and walking under guard, Eleanor riding in front of Julian on his horse, wrapped in his coat against the early morning chill, her head resting against his shoulder as the exhaustion of 4 sleepless days finally began to catch up with her. "We'll send word ahead," Julian said quietly, as the lodge disappeared behind them through the trees. "Your family will have heard nothing since the garden. They'll want to know you're safe as soon as possible." "And the wedding," Eleanor murmured, half asleep already against him. "What becomes of that after all this?" Julian pressed a careful kiss to the top of her head, steering the horse with one hand while the other stayed wrapped securely around her. "We finish it," he said simply. "Whenever you're ready. However you want it done. But we finish it, Eleanor. I did not chase you across half the county to let a wedding breakfast be the end of our story." She smiled against his shoulder, too tired to laugh, though the sound she made was close enough to it. "No heading numbering breakfasts next time," she murmured. "I think I've had quite enough excitement for one wedding." Behind them, Tommy Ridley waited at the bottom of the ridge exactly where he had promised to be, having refused every instruction to stay safely in the village once word reached him that the rescue was underway. He broke into a run at the sight of them coming down the footpath, and Eleanor lifted her head from Julian's shoulder to greet him with a smile that was, despite everything, entirely genuine. "You did it," Tommy said, breathless, looking between the two of them with open relief. "We did it," Eleanor corrected gently. "All of us. I won't forget what you did, Tommy Ridley. Not for as long as I live." The boy flushed with pride and fell into step beside the horses as the company made its slow way back toward the village, toward warm beds and hot food, and word finally being sent ahead to 2 frightened families who had spent 4 days fearing the very worst. Behind them, the old Pharaoh Lodge stood empty and silent in the gray morning light, its part in the story finished at last. The journey down from the ridge took longer than the climb up had, slowed by the need to keep watch over Pruitt and his men, and by Eleanor's own exhaustion finally catching up with her in full now that the danger had passed. She dozed against Julian's shoulder in fits and starts, waking each time the horse's gait changed, each time reassuring herself with a glance at his face that the night before had truly happened, and truly ended the way she remembered it. At the bottom of the ridge, Hollis called a brief halt to allow the men to rest the horses and see to Pruitt's guards, who sat under watch looking less like villains now and more like tired, ordinary men who had made a poor choice and were only beginning to reckon with its consequences. The heavy-set guard who had loosened his grip on Eleanor in the clearing caught her eye across the small clearing where they had stopped, and gave her a short, awkward nod that she found herself returning without any real anger behind it. "You could have turned on Pruitt sooner," she said quietly, when Julian stepped away briefly to confer with Hollis. "Why didn't you?" The guard considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Debts don't unravel themselves quick as a person might like, miss. I did what I judged right when the moment finally came. Reckon that'll have to be worth something, even if it wasn't everything." "It was worth quite a lot," Eleanor said. "More than you probably know." They reached Bexmore by mid-morning, and it was there, in the small village square, that Julian finally allowed himself to stop moving entirely, dismounting slowly, every muscle in his body aching from 2 days without proper rest, and simply standing for a long moment with his hand resting against his horse's neck, breathing in the ordinary sounds of a village going about its ordinary morning, as though nothing at all had happened. Silas Gray met them there, his face creased with relief at the sight of Eleanor upright and unharmed, and it was to him that Julian entrusted the arrangements for delivering Pruitt and his men into the custody of the county magistrate, who had finally returned from his assizes, and could now be relied upon to see the matter handled properly. "You'll want to send word to her family straight away," Silas said, already moving toward the small stable behind his cottage. "I've a rider who can be at the Hartley estate well before you could manage the ride yourselves, given the state of you both." Julian agreed gratefully, and within the hour a rider was dispatched carrying news that Eleanor Hartley had been found safe and was, even now, on her way home. It was, Julian reflected, watching the rider disappear down the road, the first genuinely good news he had been able to send anyone in 4 exhausting days, and he found the simple act of sending it brought him almost as much relief as the rescue itself had. Eleanor spent those final hours in Bexmore resting in a small room above the tavern that Ned Caro insisted on providing free of charge, refusing any payment with a gruffness that only barely disguised how relieved he was to see the young woman whose danger he had, in his own small way, helped to end. She slept properly for the first time in 4 days, deep and dreamless, and woke in the early afternoon to find Julian sitting in a chair beside her bed, having apparently refused to leave the room the entire time she slept. "You should be resting too," she murmured, still half asleep. "I will," he said. "Once I'm certain this isn't a dream I'm going to wake from and find you gone again." She reached out and took his hand, holding it against her cheek for a long moment, and neither of them said anything more for a while, content simply to sit together in the quiet, ordinary safety of an afternoon that, only a day before, had seemed impossibly far away. Later that afternoon, once Eleanor had risen and dressed properly for the first time in days, Ned Caro insisted on preparing a proper meal for them both, refusing to let either of them leave his tavern until they had eaten something more substantial than the hurried scraps they had managed since the rescue. He set the table himself, an act so far outside his usual gruff manner that his own serving girl remarked on it twice, and hovered nearby throughout the meal with the anxious attentiveness of a man determined to make up, in whatever small way he could, for a night he had spent safely at home while others rode into danger. "You gave me the first real piece of hope I'd had all night," Julian told him, when Ned finally paused long enough to sit with them briefly. "I've not forgotten it, and I don't intend to." Ned waved off the thanks with obvious discomfort, though the pleased flush in his cheeks betrayed how much the words meant to him. "Told you what I saw is all. Any man would have done the same. Not every man stops a stranger in wedding clothes at midnight and hands over his own horse without asking a single question first," Eleanor said gently. "We know precisely how rare what you did was, Mr. Caro, whether you'll accept the credit for it or not." By the time they finally set out for the Hartley estate the following morning, word of Eleanor's rescue had spread through the surrounding villages faster than either of them expected, and small clusters of people gathered along the roadside to watch them pass, some calling out blessings, others simply standing quietly with the relieved, respectful curiosity of neighbors who had spent 4 days fearing the worst for a young woman most of them had never personally met. Eleanor found the attention almost overwhelming after the isolation of the lodge, but she made herself wave and nod to each cluster of well-wishers regardless, understanding somehow that their concern, however unfamiliar to receive so openly, was a kindness that deserved acknowledgement rather than avoidance. Word reached the Hartley estate 2 hours ahead of the company itself, carried by a rider Julian had sent forward the moment the sky was light enough to see the road. By the time Eleanor rode up the same drive she had been dragged away from 4 days before, the entire household had gathered at the gates, her mother already weeping before the horses had fully stopped, her father moving faster than a man his age had any business moving, reaching Eleanor before Julian had even finished dismounting. There were tears, and there was shouting that quickly turned to laughter, and there was a long, tangled embrace between Eleanor and her parents that left all three of them speechless for a good while. The rest of the household staff stood back at a respectful distance, though more than a few of them were openly crying as well, and somewhere in the crowd Eleanor caught sight of her old nurse, Nora Bell, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes and murmuring something that sounded like a prayer of thanks. It was only once the first wave of relief had passed, once Eleanor had been fed and bathed and dressed in clean clothes that did not carry 4 days of dust and fear in their seams, that the question of the wedding itself came up again, raised gently by her mother over a quiet supper that evening. "There's no need to rush anything," her mother said carefully, watching Eleanor's face for any sign of hesitation. "After everything you've been through, no one would blame you for wanting time before." "I don't want time," Eleanor said, more firmly than she had meant to. "I want to marry him, Mother. I wanted it before any of this happened, and nothing that man did in that lodge changed that. If anything, it only made me more certain." She found Julian later that evening in the garden, the same garden where everything had gone wrong 4 days earlier, now quiet and undisturbed in the fading light, the toppled chairs long since righted, the torn flowers replaced with fresh ones, as though the household had been determined not to let the memory of that afternoon linger any longer than it had to. "I keep thinking," Julian said, when she came to stand beside him near the same table where she had been sitting when the first scream tore through the celebration, "that I should have reached you sooner, that I let you down, somehow, by not being close enough when it happened." "You reached me exactly when it mattered," Eleanor said, slipping her hand into his. "You rode through an entire night, not knowing which road to take. You gathered men and searched hills you'd never set foot on before, and you came for me the moment you had any idea where I was. I don't call that letting me down, Julian. I call that everything." He turned to look at her properly then, in the soft evening light, and something in his face eased, some tension he had been carrying since the moment he first saw the carriage disappearing down the drive finally allowing itself to release. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since long before I understood what that word was going to cost me to say aloud, and I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I was these past 4 days, riding through the dark with no idea if I would find you at all." "Then marry me," Eleanor said, properly, this time. "Here, in this same garden, so that whenever I think of what happened here, I can also think of what came after." They were married 3 weeks later, in a ceremony far smaller than the one originally planned, attended only by family and the small handful of people who had earned their place there through the events of that terrible, extraordinary week. Captain Hollis stood near the back, looking distinctly uncomfortable in formal clothes, and Tommy Ridley, scrubbed clean and dressed in a new suit that Julian had insisted on providing, sat proudly in the second row beside his uncle, grinning through the entire ceremony. Gerald Pruitt stood trial the following month and was found guilty on every charge brought against him, his desperate scheme having done nothing in the end except cost him whatever remained of his family's reputation. Eleanor felt, when she heard the verdict, less satisfaction than she had expected, and more a quiet, tired relief that the whole matter was finally, truly closed. As for Eleanor and Julian, they settled into their marriage with the particular closeness of two people who had been tested in the worst possible way, and had come through it together. Eleanor kept, tucked away in a small box on her dressing table, the hairpin she had used to work the window frame loose in that lodge, a small, strange keepsake that reminded her, whenever she saw it, exactly what she was capable of when everything seemed lost. And every year, on the anniversary of that terrible wedding breakfast, they held a quiet dinner in the same garden, inviting Tommy Ridley and his family, and Captain Hollis when his travels allowed it, and old Ned Caro the tavern keeper, who had given a desperate young duke his first true piece of hope on the darkest night of his life. It became, in time, less a memory of fear and more a celebration of everything that had been fought for and won, a reminder that the worst days did not always have to define the story, so long as there were people willing to ride through the dark for one another, and people brave enough to keep fighting even when the outcome seemed most uncertain. Eleanor and Julian's story did not end with a wedding breakfast interrupted by tragedy. It ended, and continued, with a marriage built on the certainty that when everything else had been stripped away, they had chosen each other anyway, and would go on choosing each other for every year that followed. The weeks leading up to the second wedding had their own particular strangeness, a mixture of ordinary preparation and quiet, unspoken watchfulness that neither Eleanor nor her mother fully admitted to, though both felt it. Guards were posted more discreetly around the estate than before, a precaution Lord Hartley insisted upon despite Julian's assurance that Pruitt's scheme had died with his arrest. Eleanor found she did not mind the extra caution nearly as much as she might have expected. It felt, in its own way, less like fear, and more like the household simply refusing to be caught unprepared twice. Nora Bell took over the task of remaking Eleanor's wedding gown since the original had been torn beyond repair during the kidnapping, and worked long hours by candlelight to have something ready in time, refusing every offer of help with the fierce, protective determination of a woman who had cared for Eleanor since she was a child, and intended to see this particular wrong set right personally. When she finally presented the finished gown, simpler than the first but no less beautiful, Eleanor cried for the first time since the whole ordeal had begun, not from fear this time, but from something closer to gratitude too large to hold quietly. Lord Hartley, for his part, spent a good deal of those 3 weeks in long conversations with Julian that had little to do with wedding arrangements, and a great deal to do with the practical matter of security going forward. Questions of household staffing, of routes taken when traveling, of who among the family's acquaintances might bear watching more closely than before. Julian answered every question patiently, understanding that this careful, methodical worrying was simply how Eleanor's father had chosen to process 4 days he had spent otherwise unable to control. The wedding day itself dawned clear and mild, without a hint of the chaos that had marked the first attempt. Eleanor stood again in the same garden, in the same spot where she had once been dragged away mid-celebration, and found that instead of dread, she felt only a steady, settled happiness, as though the garden itself had been waiting patiently for her to come back and finish what had been so violently interrupted. The ceremony was brief and warm, attended by perhaps 30 guests where the first had drawn well over 100, and Eleanor found she preferred it enormously this way, surrounded only by the people who had earned their place through genuine care rather than social obligation. When Julian slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands were steady in a way they had not been in weeks, and when the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small crowd's cheer carried none of the polite restraint of a formal society wedding, only plain, unguarded relief and joy. Gerald Pruitt's trial, held the following month in the county assizes, drew considerable attention from the local papers, eager for details of a scandal that touched both an old aristocratic feud and a dramatic mountain rescue. Eleanor was called to testify, and did so with a composure that surprised even herself, recounting the events of those 4 days with clear, unflinching detail, refusing to let the courtroom's attention rattle her the way Pruitt himself had once hoped to. Everett Cole, the distant relation Silas Gray had uncovered through the old parish ledgers, was found to have lent Pruitt the funds for his hired men, though he claimed, likely truthfully, that he had believed the money was meant for nothing more dramatic than settling old debts. He faced a lesser charge and a substantial fine, while Pruitt himself received a sentence severe enough to ensure the county would not see him again for a very long time. When it was all finally over, when the last of the legal proceedings had concluded and the newspapers had moved on to other, fresher scandals, Eleanor found herself thinking less and less of the fear that had once defined those 4 days, and more of everything that had grown up around it since. She thought of Tommy Ridley's courage, of Captain Hollis's steady competence, of Silas Gray's quiet diligence with old parish records, of a nameless guard's small, decisive act of conscience at exactly the moment it mattered most. It struck her, more than once in those early months of marriage, that the worst day of her life had also revealed, with startling clarity, the very best of the people around her. In the quiet months that followed the trial, Eleanor took it upon herself to see that each of those people was properly thanked, in ways more lasting than words alone. Tommy Ridley's apprenticeship was only the beginning of what she and Julian arranged on his behalf, and when the boy expressed, rather shyly, a wish to one day own land of his own rather than simply work another man's stables forever, Julian quietly began setting aside the means to make that possible once Tommy came of age. Captain Hollis was offered, and eventually accepted, a permanent position overseeing security across the Ashcombe estates, a role that suited both his skills and his evident fondness for the quiet countryside around Bexmore. Ned Caro found, rather to his own bewilderment, that his tavern's custom nearly doubled in the months following the rescue, as word of his role in it spread through the county, and curious travelers began stopping specifically to hear the story from the man who had lived it. Silas Gray declined any reward beyond Julian's sincere thanks, insisting that a parish clerk's proper duty was simply to know his own records well, and that he had done nothing more than any careful man in his position would have done. Julian respected the old clerk's wishes, though he made certain, in the years that followed, that Silas never wanted for anything the Ashcombe family could quietly provide. Eleanor herself found, in the months after her wedding, that she had changed in ways both large and small that she had not fully anticipated. She grew far less patient with idle social gossip and far more drawn to practical matters, taking an active interest in the management of the estate's finances and household affairs in a way that surprised some of the older, more traditional members of local society. Though Julian encouraged it without hesitation, finding in his wife's newfound directness something he admired rather than something to be managed or softened. She began, too, a quiet habit of visiting the families of tenant farmers personally rather than simply through intermediaries, remembering perhaps better than most how it felt to be powerless in a moment of crisis, and determined that no one within her own small sphere of influence should ever feel quite that alone if she could help it. A year had passed since that dinner in the garden, and Eleanor found herself standing once more at the base of Crake Ridge, though this time by choice, and this time with no fear at all pressing against her chest. Julian stood beside her, holding the reins of 2 horses, watching her study the old footpath with an expression that had grown used to indulging his wife's occasional need to face down her own memories on her own terms. "You don't have to do this," he said, not for the first time that morning. "I know I don't have to," Eleanor said. "I want to. There's a difference." They climbed the familiar path together, slower now, without the desperation that had driven Julian up this same slope a year before, and Eleanor found, to her quiet surprise, that the climb felt almost peaceful. The trees had grown a little fuller since that terrible week. Birdsong filled the air where once there had only been the sound of her own frightened breathing. The old Faro Lodge still stood at the top of the ridge, empty and abandoned, its windows dark, its door hanging slightly loose on one hinge. No one had claimed the land after Gerald Pruitt's conviction. The last of his family's claim to it dissolved along with everything else he had tried to salvage. Eleanor walked up to the small window of the room where she had been held, the very window she had worked loose with a hairpin over 4 long, frightening days, and pressed her palm briefly against the warped wooden frame. I used to lie awake counting the boards in the ceiling, she said quietly. I told myself that as long as I kept counting, kept noticing things, I hadn't given up. It felt important somehow, to keep paying attention. Julian came to stand beside her, saying nothing, simply letting her have the moment. I don't feel frightened anymore, Eleanor said, after a while, sounding almost surprised by her own words. I thought I might, coming back here, but mostly, I just feel proud of the woman who sat in that room and refused to stop looking for a way out. You should feel proud, Julian said. I've told you that 100 times this past year, and I intend to keep telling you for the rest of our lives, whether you believe me or not. They did not stay long at the lodge. There was little reason to, beyond the closure Eleanor had come seeking, and within the hour they were riding back down toward the village, toward Bexmore, where a rather more cheerful reunion was waiting for them. Tommy Ridley had grown a full inch in the past year, something he announced proudly the moment he spotted Julian and Eleanor riding into the village square. He had taken, at Julian's quiet insistence and his own eager willingness, an apprenticeship with a respected horse trainer 2 counties over, a position that would have been entirely out of reach for a stable boy from Bexmore under any ordinary circumstances. He spoke now with the easy confidence of a boy who had discovered, at a young age, exactly what he was capable of when it mattered. I still remember every word you told me to say, he told Eleanor, as they sat together outside Ned Caro's tavern later that afternoon. The old tavern keeper himself bustling about refilling cups with more enthusiasm than his usual gruff manner typically allowed. I practiced it the whole way down the ridge, so I wouldn't forget any of it. You didn't forget a single word, Eleanor said. You saved my life that day, Tommy Ridley, and I don't say that lightly. Captain Hollis joined them before the afternoon was through, having settled permanently in Bexmore after the events of that week, finding in the quiet village a peace he had not expected to want after so many years of soldiering. He and Julian had grown into an easy, comfortable friendship in the months since, the kind built on having faced something difficult together and come through it intact. Any word on the Faroe lands? Hollis asked, settling into a chair with the unhurried ease of a man entirely at home in his surroundings. None that concerns us, Julian said. Whatever family remains has shown no interest in reviving old grievances. I suspect Pruitt's conviction settled the matter rather thoroughly, for anyone who might have been tempted to try something similar. Good, Hollis said simply. Some stories are better left finished. As evening settled over Bexmore, Eleanor and Julian took their leave, riding back toward home, under a sky just beginning to fill with stars. The same stars, Eleanor realized, that had watched over her 4 sleepless nights in that lodge a year before, though they seemed, now, to carry an entirely different weight. I used to think, she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, that the worst thing that could happen to a person was to have their happiness interrupted right at the moment they thought it was finally secure. I thought, sitting in that room, that nothing good could ever fully outweigh what had been taken from me that day. And now I think the interruption was never the whole story. It was only the hardest part of it. Everything that came after, you finding me, Tommy's courage, Captain Hollis's steady hand, even the strange, quiet peace I felt walking through that lodge today. All of that belongs to the story too. I don't think I'd trade any of it, even the fear, because it led here. Julian reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, holding it the rest of the way home, saying nothing more because nothing more needed saying. They rode together through the gathering dark, 2 people who had been tested in the worst way a new marriage could be tested, and who had come through it not merely intact, but somehow stronger, more certain of each other than either of them might have believed possible on the morning of a wedding breakfast that had gone so terribly wrong. Behind them, the hills of Crake Ridge faded into shadow, holding their secrets quietly, the way old places often do, while ahead of them, warm lights glowed in the windows of a home that had, after everything, finally earned its peace. That evening, once they had returned and settled by the fire together, Eleanor found herself telling Julian something she had never fully put into words before, even in the long months since her rescue. There was a moment, in that room, when I stopped being afraid of Pruitt specifically, she said, watching the flames rather than his face. I became afraid, instead, of becoming a person who simply waited for things to happen to her. That frightened me far more than anything he ever said or did. Julian listened without interrupting, understanding by now that these quiet confessions came to her slowly, in their own time, and were not to be rushed. And now? He asked, when she seemed to have finished. Now I think I learned, in that room, exactly the kind of person I actually am, underneath all the ordinary comforts of a life that had never once tested me before. I'm rather glad to know it, strange as that sounds. It doesn't sound strange at all, Julian said. I learned something about myself on that ridge too. I learned I would ride until I fell from the saddle before I'd ever stop looking for you. I'm glad to know that about myself as well. They sat together a long while after that, saying little, intent in the easy silence that had grown between them over the past year. A silence built not on absence of things to say, but on the simple, steady comfort of two people who no longer needed to fill every quiet moment with words to know exactly how the other one felt. In the years that followed, Eleanor and Julian's household grew. First with the arrival of a daughter they named after Eleanor's grandmother, and later a son who bore, much to Julian's quiet delight, a stubborn streak that reminded everyone who knew him of his mother's own refusal to be easily deterred. Tommy Ridley remained a fixture in their lives long after his apprenticeship ended, eventually taking charge of the Ashcombe stables himself, a position he filled with the same quiet competence and courage he had shown as a boy on Crake Ridge. Captain Hollis stayed on in Bexmore until his own passing many years later, having become, in the intervening decades, something closer to family than friend. And every year, without fail, on the anniversary of that terrible, extraordinary wedding breakfast, Eleanor and Julian gathered the people who had carried them through it, in the same garden where it had all begun, to remember not the fear of that day, but everything brave and steady and true that had risen up to answer it. It became, over time, less a story about what had been taken from them, and more a story about everything they had built afterward, together, out of the simple, unshakable determination never to let each other go again.